18th. And first we will make sure that we have a quorum. So I'm Mary Fagan. I'm the board vice president. I'm the chair of the nursing practice committee. Jovita Dominguez.
Good morning. This is Jovita Dominguez, appointed by Governor Newsom, and welcome.
And then Dolores.
Good morning. I'm Dolores Trujillo. I was appointed from Governor Newsom in the nurse direct care provider role. I'm sorry. And I am the current president of the BRN. Thank you.
And Vicki Granowitz.
Vicki Granowitz. I was appointed by Senate Pro Tempore Tony Atkins as a public member.
And then we have Macaulay. She on?
Macaulay would not be on.
Okay. I think you have most of the agenda items, or at least the beginning items, right, Lori? But we'll start with public comments not on the agenda. Mark, will you open up for public comment?
Mark, I'm not hearing you if you are speaking to open up for public comment.
Sorry, I turned it off and turned it on. Can I do the how we run a WebEx, or do we think we know that already?
You can do the how we run a WebEx and then go into public comment.
Okay, real quick. Good morning. This is the BRN moderator. I will be moderating the meeting. To facilitate public comment, we will be utilizing the WebEx question and answer feature. When the committee reaches a point in the agenda at which public comment is appropriate, the question and answer feature will be turned on, and members of the public will indicate that they would like to make a comment by inserting the phrase, "I would like to make a comment," in the question box, which is typically in the lower right of your screen. We will also query our physical location in Sacramento if there are any public members there. I will then call on the individual and unmute their microphone. The individual will have 2 minutes to make their comments. I will not give a warning as your time approaches. I will mute your microphone and will announce that your time has exceeded the time allotted. I will then proceed to the next member of the public who has a comment. Please note that the question and answer feature is being used only as a means for members of the public to represent that they would like to make a verbal comment. When your turn comes, you will be prompted to unmute. If your question can be answered, the committee will respond accordingly. When making your comment, speak about anything you believe is important for the members to know. Remember, committee members cannot address any item not on the agenda, items not on the agenda at that moment, and items that you would like to add to a future meeting or items that will be discussed later on the agenda will be discussed at their appropriate times during the meeting. I will provide a brief reminder of this approach at the start of each public comment item. Finally, when committee members or BRN staff are not speaking, I would like to remind them to mute their microphone. If I detect background noise during the meeting as a result of unmuted microphones, I will mute your microphone automatically. Now, we will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment."
Mark, while you're pausing to allow for this to happen, I just wanted to do a reminder. I know that Rez had done it in the past, but on these virtual meetings, it is important for all of our committee members to stay on camera for the entirety of the meeting. And if they do have to go off camera, they have to let us know, and then we'll address at that point. Reza, was there anything further that I needed to address?
No, thanks for covering that, Lori.
Thank you, no problem.
And I'm just trying to get the physical location's name so I can promote them in case anybody there needs to speak. Oh, I found it. Sacramento Public Meeting. That must be it. All right. Committee Chair Fagan, there are no public requests for comments on the WebEx. Do we have any public requests for comments there in the physical location?
I'm not hearing any responses from that location.
There are no requests for public comment in Sacramento.
Thank you. Committee Chair Fagan, would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. Okay, we'll move to agenda item 7.2, review and vote on whether to approve the previous meeting minutes from June 29th, 2023. Is that correct? Yeah. Are there any comments from any of the committee members? I'd like to make a motion to approve the committee minutes on June 29th, 2023.
This is Vicky. I'll second.
Thanks, Vicki. Okay, I guess we'll take this out to public comment.
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in the request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate that they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment." Committee Chair Fagan, there are no public requests for comments in the WebEx. Do we have any public requests for comments in Sacramento?
We have no requests for public comment in Sacramento.
Thank you. Committee Chair Fagan, would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. Okay, we can take it to a vote. I'm Mary Fagan, vote yes. Dolores Trujillo?
Dolores Trujillo votes yes.
Jovita Dominguez?
Jovita Dominguez, yes.
And Vicki Granowitz?
Granowitz, yes.
We will move on to agenda item 7.3, committee updates from the advisory committees, which is informational only. And Lori, I think that you have these updates for us.
I definitely do. Excuse me. The quick updates are the CRNA and the CNS advisory committees. They were last held in January, so we covered that at the February board meeting update. And so there's nothing to report out from those two committees. The NEWAC committee will actually have an agenda item later on in this committee where we will discuss the simulation regulation recommendations that came from that. And Garrett Chan, the chair, will be here and elevated to speak more on that as well. Other than that, the NEWAC committee did finalize the participants for their various subcommittees. So we are very excited to have those subcommittees start their important work and report those out to the NEWAC at the scheduled meetings. The two subcommittees that were formed were already, one was sunset essentially because that one is no longer needed. And that was on the workforce survey because that had been completed. And we would re-up that committee again when the next workforce survey comes out, and that's an every 2-year process. And the simulation committee, that one formed at the very beginning of NEWAC. And they were the ones that really kind of jumped in, started working on NEWAC guidelines, which were brought in front of the board last meeting and were passed. And now they're looking at the regulations, which they'll discuss later today. Nurse Practitioner Advisory Committee and Nurse Midwife Advisory Committee, both they meet on the same day. They both met on the 26th of March. And their agenda items have been fairly similar in nature from each time, just because they kind of follow the similar path. And so in March, the Nurse Midwife Advisory Committee, they discussed election of chair and vice chair because there was, nurse midwife, yes, because the chair of the nurse midwife committee resigned, so they had to appoint a new one and then do a vice chair position. And then they reported out some of their subcommittee work. There was not a lot that had taken place in that prior reporting period. So we did offer some additional guidance with that. We offered to reach out and help to try to facilitate some of those subcommittees. And the largest discussion that happened with both NMAC and PAC is another agenda item here in the Nurse Practice Advisory Committee. And that is discussions on possible changes to the disciplinary guidelines. As I'm sure many of the members and stakeholders are aware, that with the advancements in scope of practice and supervision with our advanced practice RN roles, it has created a kind of gap within our disciplinary guidelines that we do need to address to allow for those licensees to continue in their current practice without that supervision while they're on probation. And so there is some updates that need to be happening, and we will discuss that when it comes to that agenda item. And then for Nurse Practice Advisory Committee, it was almost a direct copy and paste to that. And so with that, we did get some disciplinary guidelines discussion as well. They did finish kind of looking at the subcommittee work. And one of the subcommittees that really kind of brought out some information was the discipline subcommittee within the Nurse Practice Advisory Committee, where they pulled a lot of the stats and trended. And they realized that there was not a lot of nurse practitioners that are getting disciplined, and that the ones that are getting disciplined are not practice related. They are typically diversion, DUI, some kind of substance abuse issue that kind of creeps in there that that needs addressed to do the public protection to be able to rehabilitate them, get them back into practice. And then we did an update on AB 890 and provided some guidance on that. There is a bill that is moving through, and we will, our board discussed that at the last board meeting, took positions on that. The board did support that, and that bill that moves through addresses the issue that blocked the retired or legacy nurse practitioner national certifications from becoming a 103 or a 104. So if that bill goes through and it is signed into law as of January 1, we will have updated our processes here to allow for the legacy and retired nurse practitioner national certification holders to go ahead and complete the transition of practice and move to a 103 and then eventually into a 104 status. So those were kind of the big conversations and discussion items within NPAC and NMAC. And then just reminding you guys that we do have a couple agenda items here where we'll get into more details of those items that were voted to go on to nurse practice for additional consideration, and CNS and CRNA subcommittees did not hold a meeting during the time from this last board meeting to this committee meeting. Any questions?
All right.
Lori, just real quick.
Yes.
The bill that you spoke of just now that we supported, what is the number on that bill?
I knew you were going to ask me that. That's a really good question.
Okay.
And I don't have it on the top of my head because I was right before this meeting, I was focused on another bill, our faculty bill. And so I was working back and forth with the
That's okay. I don't have my
person,
list
and
of bills,
it's
but-
gone. It's a DCA wide cleanup bill. And there is just a very small section in there where the language states that the exam that needed to be reviewed, that was put forward with the section 105 of AB 890, when we had to have OPES come in and do the examination review and say that it met independent practice, and then that current review continued and then would be an ongoing review. In that section, the language was written in that it said that is only for exams that are 2017 and newer, that exams 2017 and older would be grandfathered in and not have to have that exam review or ongoing exam review, because that was the only section that was written when AB 890 passed that held up our ability as the board to be able to include those in the first round. And so that was addressed. That language is in there. It is in the DCA cleanup bill. And hopefully that helps to narrow down what bill you guys are looking for. But I will, as we move through, I will pull that up. I have that. It's just not on my fingertips right now.
I remember supporting it, but I'm drawing a blank. I have my bills in front of me, so sorry about that. Anyway, thank you.
It is a committee bill, if that's helpful as well. We'll start to narrow it down here real quick.
Thanks, Lori.
No problem.
All right, any other comments or questions from the committee members? As this is informational only, I think we don't need to go to public comment. Is that correct?
We do need to go to public comment. We do not need a motion.
Oh, all right. Then board moderator, can you please take us to public comment?
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I would like to give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment."
Lori, if you're talking, you're muted.
I am muted. Okay. It is Senate Bill 1451, introduced by Ashby, and it's on professions and vocations.
Thank you, Lori.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't have it at the tip of my tongue, but I was able to pull it up. Thank you.
We have no public requests for comments on the WebEx. Do we have any public requests for comments in Sacramento?
No request for public comment in Sacramento. Thank you.
Chair Fagan, would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. Okay, we'll move to agenda item 7.0, which is discussion and possible action regarding the NEWAC recommendations on proposed draft regulatory language for standards on simulation and clinical education.
Thank
Laura,
you.
are you going to take this, or is it Garrett?
It will be both of us. And so, board moderator, can you elevate? I see that you just elevated him. Thank you. So Garrett Chan is the chair of the NEWAC committee. He was also one of the members of the simulation subcommittees that worked on this. And just for a quick reorient to that, each committee can have a subcommittee where 2 members can meet without noticing a specific location to allow for work to be done in between scheduled open meetings. The intent of that is not to work in secret or to hide. It is to expedite work and allow for work to continue in between the meetings. And then all of that information is shared out at the noticed committee that is held twice a year. And so at that point, when that information is shared out, it is brought, it is agendaized. There's an agenda item summary so people know what we discussed. And then it is talked about and reported out. Other advisory committee members are able to have conversations and discussions, ask questions, get questions answered. And then ultimately they must come to a agreement via motion and second and vote in order to move things through. So some history with 7.4 is the simulation subcommittee did report this out at the 2 NEWAC meetings prior. And what was accepted in that first go around was the standards for simulation and clinical experiences that was brought forth and moved through our board, and our board did accept those simulation standards. The NEWAC committee at that moment asked for additional time to look into the regulatory language that was presented by the simulation subcommittee. We did agendaize that on the next NEWAC committee, which was just this previous one held in 2024. And when that was discussed, there were a lot of questions that went back and forth, some additional information that was provided, and they ultimately did recommend through a vote that this come forward to the Nurse Practice Advisory Committee, so that, sorry, not advisory, just Nurse Practice Committee, so that you guys can continue to have some further discussion and information. So at this point, I will hand it over to Garrett. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lori, and good morning to the board. It's great to be here, and sorry about not showing up to the 2023 meetings. I now have them all on my calendar, so you'll see me a lot more regularly. And I also want to thank EO Melby for the great summary of the work that's been done for the simulation standards and her support along with the staff. Just one more piece of background is in the BRN Sunrise legislation 2684, it was required that NEWAC actually studied the possibility for simulation standard, or not possibility, but it said to study the simulation standards. And so that's why we did this, is to comply with Business and Professions section 2785.6 subdivision C. And so as a result of, again, what Lori was saying, that we met with a wide variety of stakeholders across California, both academic as well as practice, simulation experts and non-simulation experts, to make these recommendations. We made a few recommendations, but the last that the Nurse Practice Committee has already reviewed and the board has voted on, as Lori mentioned, we had this last piece about recommending regulations. And you can see that in the Nurse Practice Committee packet on page 13. I want to be very clear that these regulations are draft. The spirit is there. There are some additional things that need to be worked out, some really great points that Lori brought up around, ensuring that this isn't overly restrictive to outside applicants. So we want to make sure that that's included, and it's not in the draft here. So we heard her concerns, and we think they're absolutely valid. We also heard concerns from other NEWAC committee members about some clarification, so those will also need to be put in. But what I'm submitting to the Nurse Practice Committee today is the concept that we need regulations for a variety of different reasons. As everybody knows, the Board of Registered Nursing is here for the public protection. And we know that if simulation is not done well, it actually can create significant psychological and emotional trauma to nursing students. There has been quite a bit of research out there in the literature in simulation that says simulation that is not done well doesn't achieve learning outcomes, and it also can create harm. And so it's against this backdrop that the members of the public, through our subcommittee work, really strongly recommended the development of standards for the BRN. And so again, this is what you see in the packet. I guess the last thing I'll say before we move forward is that as a result of a robust conversation at our last NEWAC meeting, the committee the NEWAC committee members unanimously recommended to move this forward. So again, with the caveats that we should look at things and important things that Lori and others brought up. But again, the spirit of the concepts that will help protect the public will exist in the current draft. Lori, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. So just some historical background for our board to consider is that historically there was a misconception that pre-licensure educators believed that the BRN oversaw simulation. We do not. The board has not overseen simulation. In fact, they've been silent on simulation from inception. When you look at our statutory language, there was no talk about simulation. And when you looked at our regulatory language, the current regulatory language that we have, which is found in 16 CCR 14, sorry, let me find it here real quick, 1420, is in the definitions. And within the definitions that are provided, it does mention simulation in one area, and it talks about clinical practice. And it says clinical practice means the planning, learning, experiences designed for students to apply nursing knowledge and skills to meet course objectives in a variety of board-approved clinical settings. Clinical practice includes learning experiences provided in various healthcare agencies, as well as nursing skills labs, simulation labs, and computer labs. And that is the only area in our entire NPA that simulation was ever addressed. This became an issue when NCSBN released a study that said that up to 50% of simulation, if done well, that's the caveat that Garrett is really pushing here, which is absolutely correct, can replace direct patient care hours at a 1-to-1 ratio. And the key with that is to be done well. So when that was put out, everybody wanted to go to 50% sim, and they said the board was blocking that. So I'll explain what happened there. We opined on direct patient care hours. And at that time, we had stated that all direct patient care hours, 75% must be in direct patient care. Again, silent on the 25% that was remaining. So schools did have the opportunity to use that 25% in sim, in skills, in observation, in any type of practical experience that met the current clinical objectives that they developed. And so the board, again, did not oversee that, did not manage that, did not provide guidance on that. But when we did evaluate them, we ensured that those activities met their clinical objectives. And so that was it. Then when COVID hit, AB 2288 was introduced and ultimately passed, and that implemented Business and Professions Code 2786.3. And when Business and Professions Code 2786.3 was introduced, and now that did provide the board with some simulation responsibility. And it was specifically only on the use of the emergency provisions that were outlined to make it easier for our academic institutions to make it through the barriers that were put in front of them during COVID. And so the statement said the substitute clinical hours that are not in direct patient care that are simulation experiences are based on the best practice published by the International Nursing Association for Clinical Simulation and Learning, the National Councils of State Boards of Nursing, and the Society of Simulation in Healthcare, or equivalent standards as approved by the board. That has been a statement that has now been in place since, I believe, the end of 2020. And this is something that our NECs have been able to look at and monitor. And that is the only guidance that the schools are held to, is that they must be based on the best practices from one of those or the equivalent standards approved by the board. And to date, the board has not approved equivalent standards up until our last board meeting where that was approved. And so then when our Sunrise bill came through, that was updated. And as Garrett referenced, in the NEWAC, when they put NEWAC from just being a board committee, advisory committee, into being the statutorily required, on 2785.5G, it says the committee shall study and recommend standards for simulated clinical experiences based on the best practices published by, again, the International Nursing Association of Clinical Simulation and Learning, the National Council's State Boards of Nursing, the Society for Simulation Healthcare, or equivalent standards. So the identical language that was put into the Bill 2788. So with that, the board in the last board meeting has actually met G's requirement, and we now have equivalent standards that were approved by the board that have been put forth by this subcommittee. This is an additional ask from the subcommittee and now an additional ask from NEWAC that has been put forward for the board to consider potentially adding in new regulatory language. The motion that is up here, just so that everybody's clear, is in alignment with Garrett's ask. And as well the subcommittee and NEWAC, and that is to initiate drafting of regulatory language. This does not mean the board accepts the regulatory language as written. So just to make that clear, this is sample language, draft language, as Garrett has put forward. And what this does is this allows our Chief of Ledge, Marissa, to take that sample language and to continue to flush it out, meet with SMEs. And if we do come up with a final draft language, bring that back in front of the board, where the board will then move to either accept it and move forward with the package to go to OAL. So there is still some additional work that does need to be done in order for this to move as a regulatory package. But this does start the work with it now being, if the motion is to accept it, now being put into our board staff's hands, because this came from an advisory committee and now it will go into board staff's hands for this. When I met with COADN and CACN in two different conferences these last month or so, the one thing that constantly came out that was said is they didn't want more regulatory oversight from our board. And in fact, they are asking for less. One of the public comments that came out at one of the advisory committee mentioned about BRN overreach. This was not part of NEWAC, but this was part of NPAC. And so as we look at whether or not we want to bring in more regulation, that is always something that we should consider when we're looking at increasing our regulatory oversight from something that we had not done in the past. Garrett has an amazing point that the board's entire purpose is public protection. And when you identify that people are being affected by simulation that's not being implemented well, that is where the board should step in and consider to move this forward. Is it to be just entering a regulation that states that they shall use these best practices? Because again, that's something we do not have set in stone. That prior bill was only for clinical hours that are affected by, prior law that came forward from the bill was only clinical experiences that were affected by COVID and the state of emergency. That was replacing our already required direct patient care hours. So for you guys to have a clear understanding, the language that was brought forth for NEWAC to study, the language that was put into AB 2288 that was moved forward, those are not in regulation, and that language is not something that we require our nursing schools to do. And so you may consider just, again, directing them to those larger simulation standards, and we, as the BRN, through our nursing education consultants, when we do our evaluations on the schools, would see if they meet those standards. And that would be the extent, because those are the standards that are out there. We could also consider the regulation language that is being brought forth here by NEWAC. and be a little more prescriptive. There is another body, the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, that has some basic regulatory language that addresses simulation. And I believe, Garrett, you had mentioned that you kind of use that as a launching place for that. So that has been incorporated into Garrett's language. That stuff is evidence-based. There's a lot of documentation with that. And Garrett's team only did some minor kind of updates to that to address the new research that they have come across that supports that there's additional items that maybe we should consider. So just that further background, and I'll pass it back to you, Garrett.
Great. Thanks so much, Lori. I completely agree with everything that you said. I just would ask the Nurse Practice Committee to consider moving this forward as a formal request, given to your point, Lori, is that the additional information that we're getting now about the psychological and emotional harms. And we believe, I'm all for, smart regulation. I don't like excessive regulation. So I'm not saying that there is or there's not. I'm just going to say philosophically, I'm, for smart regulation. And the public has spoken. This was also drafted not by me, but by experts in the field. And so it is my request that NPC move forward with this, and so that we can start the process. And we're going to include, of course, along the way, more public comment and input.
I think additionally, Garrett, you could definitely claim yourself as one of the experts. And I think that's one of the main things that we can take into consideration here is Garrett is the CEO of Health Impact and the Simulation Alliance, Benner Institute, et cetera, et cetera. This is his life. So for him to state that he consulted with experts and leave himself out, he is definitely an expert in this field. And so to have that knowledge and this person on our team, that is definitely of a benefit for consideration. So if you go to page 12 of the meeting packet, this is where the draft regulatory language begins. You will notice that there is no strikeouts and there is no underlines because this is all new language. It does address definitions on simulation, pre-briefing, debriefing, and psychological safety. And then it goes into the simulation and pre-licensure nursing education, where it talks about sections A, B, 1 and 2, C, D, E, F, G, H, and then I, J, and then 1 through 5, sorry. K, and then this is L and 3. Does that make sense, Garrett? Or is that a typo?
I think there's a typo in the 3.
Okay. And so that should be an M?
But,
okay.
Lori, again, you made some excellent points in NEWAC. I think that should also be taken into consideration as we continue to move forward. So, yeah, the membrane will change. So sorry about that.
Hey, not a problem. One of the things I guess I should bring up was the points that I made in NEWAC, so that you guys have complete understanding of what went on there. When we're looking at addressing pre-licensure nursing education, we have to look at the way that our statutes and regulations kind of work together and what kind of everything does that overlaps. And so we do have in 16 CCR Article 3, the pre-licensure nursing program, and that is the regulatory guidance for all of our California board-approved nursing programs. Then when you look into the scope of regulation that's outlined in our Business Professions Code, it talks about endorsing applicants. And so when we have a application that comes from a person that wants to become an RN in California, and they were educated from a school that was not California board approved, we have a statement in our Business Professions Code that says that in the board's opinion, they meet the comparable education standards as ours. And so that makes things a little more complicated to become licensed in California. And I'll explain that a little bit more. We use the word reciprocity for licensing from state to state. And we use the word endorsement. We in California do not have a true endorsement or reciprocity that some other states do. And I'll explain that a little bit further as well. In every 50 states and 4 territories have their own Nurse Practice Act. Each one of those Nurse Practice Acts delineate whether or not they oversee their nursing education programs, whether or not those nursing education programs must be accredited or not accredited. They oversee whether or not, what are the requirements for licensure based on education, whether a degree is required, whether or not a background is required, whether it's a DOJ background, whether it's an FBI background. They dictate many different things, including discipline and what items we can be disciplined on. And we know that disciplinary action is different from state to state as well. Those were some of kind of like the big concerns that were kind of brought up and discussed over the prior years when we're looking at nursing compacts. This is kind of a same process here. So when we're looking at this, all that California is allotted for is if you've taken the NCLEX in another state and you've passed, you do not have to retake the NCLEX. That is the only thing. All other education standards must be met as if you were educated in California at a pre-licensure level. This is the problem that we addressed with 1410.5 when we added that if you have successfully passed micro and A&P and they did not have a lab and you've practiced for 2 years, well, we don't hold you accountable to micro and A&P with a lab of having to redo that because that was impeding endorsing applicants from coming into California. Even if they had a PhD in nursing, they've been working as an advanced practice RN for 20 years. If their pre-licensure nursing education does not meet the licensing requirements in California, they cannot get licensed here in California without doing some sort of remediation. So this is where I brought that up in NEWAC, that if we go ahead and add additional regulatory oversight to this nursing education, pre-licensure nursing education section, then when we have a student that comes from a school that's not California approved, we would then have to evaluate whether or not they meet that process. Our current process for school evaluation is if somebody graduates from a school that we have not already reviewed internationally and nationally, that we collect various amounts of information on that school, licensing personnel review it. It then could go to a nursing education consultant or myself to be reviewed. It is then compared against our statutory and regulatory guidance for pre-licensure nursing programs. And if approved, then school students that have went to that school, we will be able to process them through once we get proof of transcript and we get a school code that goes into our system and they are able to be licensed here. With this new addition, we would have to add that to the licensing requirement where when we were, the way that it's written, so this is just to talk hypothetically, if it were to go through the way that it is now, the way that it's written, we would now have to re-review the international schools and when they are applying, as well as our out-of-state nursing students when they are applying, to ensure that the school that they went to, if they used clinical hours in simulation, that those simulation met these standards. Not standards, met our regulations. Caveat to that is most simulation programs do meet those standards that were put forth in AB 2288, put forth for NEWAC to study, and put forth that BRN accepted. And so those are standards, we can hold them to that, and that does not affect our current process. if we go ahead and write regulations, those regulations do affect our current process. We would have to do that additional evaluation. We'd have to move forward. This opens up so many areas of discussion, right? On do we address this regulatory wise? Do we leave it as standards and then get that accepted in regulation that those are our standards? And that is really up for you guys to really have discussions about, look at, and then if we are moving this through a regulatory process, again, there are several options that can happen within that. Where if we are meeting with this, we can continue to meet with Garrett as an expert, and we can continue to meet with other stakeholders. We can have meetings, select feedback, and then as you guys are very much aware, when it does come in front of our board or our practice committee, that we do have public comment. And if it does get moved forward where we do submit it to OAL, it does go out for an official public comment that we have to respond to every single person that responds, and we can update language at that time as well. So there is definite room, if we move this forward today, to continue to have these discussions and continue to look at changes and options. So hopefully that helps to kind of bring you guys up to speed on those conversations that were had in NEWAC that I don't think was expected, but definitely was received. And thank you guys for taking that into consideration as we move forward. We don't want unintended consequences where all of a sudden we have a regulation that further creates barriers for people that want to come in from out of state as well as international.
Lori, this is Reza. One thing that I wanted to ask that could, I think, use a little clarification. You mentioned that the board kind of adopted standards and could hold schools to it. I want to make sure I didn't mishear that. What can you clarify on that?
So if we choose to move the standards that the board adopted last meeting, then we can put those into regulations and we can hold schools accountable for that.
Okay.
And we could do it that way, separate from specifically writing out the individual regulations. We could make the statement that is what is said currently in the Business Professions Code under 2785.5, where the Sunset Bill said these are the standards that they wanted NEWAC to look at. And under 2786.3D, which were the standards that were, which is identical language that were put in from AB 2288 being passed for the simulation that was in place of the direct patient care hours during the emergency. And so let me pull up the meeting packet from the prior board meeting.
So just to be clear, it sounds like you're saying that the board can hold schools to it if it passes a regulation.
Yes.
And it can pass a regulation to adopt a certain set of already existing standards by incorporating them by reference, or it can essentially draft its own standards based upon those several different sets of standards that were spelled out in the statute. That's what I'm kind of understanding.
Correct. Yes.
But either way, we would only be able to hold anyone to it via having it in regs.
Yes. And I'm trying to pull up those standards. Yes. And I'm trying to pull those standards. I probably should have had them ready for the meeting. Sorry about that. Where those were brought forth, and it might have been the November meeting. Garrett, do you remember by chance when you guys passed them out of your committee?
Yeah, we passed them out of NEWAC. We had our September 28th meeting in 2023.
Okay, so it would have been November. Perfect. Thank you. That's super, super helpful. And so in November board meeting, we did agenda item 7.2. And the standards that were brought forth and the board accepted and moved forward were the pre-licensure RN programs who use simulation should adhere to at least one of the sets of standards set forth by INACSL, NCSBN, or SSH, and BRN does not need to create new simulation standards for programs. BRN should accept without requiring additional documentation or action, INACSL endorsement or SSH accreditation as meeting any simulation requirements set forth by the BRN. And that was the recommendations of the standards that NEWAC put forth on March 30th, 2023, when they created that subcommittee. And then on September 28th, 2023, NEWAC discussed the recommendations and motion to move those forward to the board, and our board accepted those. So we could move those forward and put them into regulations to have that be what we hold them to, or we could draft this regulatory language that Garrett has presented here from the NEWAC for consideration, and be more prescriptive at that point to answer those. Garrett, I do have one question that just popped into my head. Those standards that are within INACSL, NCSBN, SSH, do they address the psychological impact?
Yes, part of it is well, Enaxel, so it's called INACSL instead of Enaxel. That's how we call it. Really is the primary source of the standards. NCSBN and the Society for Simulation in Healthcare, or SSH, also reference Enaxel standards because they're actually not just for nursing, they're for any profession. And so the concern that the reason why there is some more information in the proposed draft regulations that you see in your packet today is because in the event that they're not in an event that a program is not currently adherent to any of those, Enaxel, NCSBN, or SSH, then these are kind of then the minimum things that have to happen, and they will promote psychological safety and decrease emotional trauma. So I hope that answers your question.
So if you were able to point out on page 12, I believe, which one specifically addressed the psychological impact, because we may be able to do some sort of a hybrid where we could move forward with the regulations where the regulations incorporate the simulation standards that the board has already accepted. And then if where it said, other standards as approved by the board. And so if any of our schools did not follow those specific standards, if you could let us know which one specifically addresses psychological harm, that would be something that we probably would then incorporate as the public health, the public safety kind of aspect.
Yeah.
That might be helpful for those that are not. But it does say in the language, pre-licensure RN programs who use simulation should. I think we would need to clarify that would be shall or may, because if it is a shall, then all nursing programs must do that, and there would not be room for anybody to have a simulation program that is not Enaxel or the INACSL. And so those are additional considerations.
Absolutely. Great questions. And I also look forward to when we get to public comment, hearing from the public as well to get their perspective. I'm going to point to, I think it's G, faculty involved in simulations, both didactic and clinical, shall have training in the use of simulation, right? All simulation training talks about psychological safety. It is like the fundamental core that we always talk about when we do any kind of training, whether it's a debriefing specific training, or if it's just like, how do you use simulation scenarios, you always embed psychological safety as the fundamental component to that. And one of the things that we have heard from the public, especially from graduates of programs that have unfortunately had negative experiences around simulation, is that we have found that the faculty have not had training, both formal formal training and sometimes even informal training. They haven't even they were just named, you're the simulation person. And so that's one area that I can definitely point out is letter G. H, also professional development. Again, psychological safety is such a big thing right now in simulation that everybody's getting it. I think the other thing that this regulation, and I know I'm going to say this, and I know I'm not answering your question directly, Lori, so I apologize, but I think it's important to mention, is that if we look at E, which says there shall be a budget that will sustain the simulation activities and training of the faculty, we see that, programs allegedly are just like throwing things together and they're finding things, and there's really these substitutes which are perhaps not either high quality or the faculty are not trained. And so by requiring that there is a budget of some sort means that there are going to be resources dedicated to this pedagogy. And I know I'm not answering your question directly, but
you are actually.
Okay.
You are. Yeah, no, this is great information. No, it's okay. It's totally great. That's what these conversations are really good for. When you mentioned the budget, I just wanted to kind of clarify with you, we do have a separate regulation within the nursing programs that require adequate resources, including, faculty, et cetera, et cetera. And we also have a section in our that talks about faculty onboarding and orientation. And so if we did have a statement where we put into regulations that they had to meet these standards, those other regulations would now overlap and work with that, right? Because those would now be a requirement that the board would have to maintain. And those requirements would then be included when we looked at resources. They would be included when we looked at ongoing professional development and stuff. And so that is how regulations, even though we read them separately, when they're within a section of pre-licensure, they're all kind of intertwined, and we look at them kind of as a spider web almost yep. Instead of just one by one, because you can have an area of non-compliance or of kind of risk or recommendation in one section, and then that'll affect like 3 other sections down that line. And so you even see later on in ELC today, where you would have like 3 areas of noncompliance and then related areas of noncompliance. And that's how that's put. So you can see how everything just kind of goes there. Your the faculty involvement. Yeah, definitely. I think those are great ones. I think that is something that we can move forward and get started with. So if our nurse practice committee here is in agreement with that, I think this provides us a lot of information to get started. And I think that if we can tie these in to some of our current regulations, where it would not change, right? So if our resources section, if we add the requirement that these schools that have simulation have these kind of standards, which I can guarantee you by being involved at the NCSBN national level, that schools that operate with simulation, the majority of them do follow this. It would be our kind of one-offs that don't. And those one-offs we always take a look at anyways. And they, like with Excelsior College, they didn't have even clinical. And so, there will be some schools that their graduates would not be allowed without a remedial process here in California, be allowed to come in and practice in California. But that is not something that is new. And so if we were to refer back to those simulation standards, if we were to then incorporate some of these ideas into our current standards that are there and not create additional ones, just provide some updated clarifications on those as we move through this regulatory process, I think that we can do this without having an effect to our endorsing applicants in. And that obviously would be something I would bring forward too as we kind of move this process, meet with our regulatory attorneys at DCA, et cetera. And if we do run across a comment where a stakeholder says, no, this would block, then we would obviously take a deeper dive into that to make sure that that would not be a hindrance for any kind of license portability.
I have nothing else. I welcome comments from the Nurse Practice Committee members or the public, whatever the chair decides.
Yeah, I mean, this has been such an interesting conversation, and I feel like it's like an onion that keeps getting peeled and new things are coming up. So, although, I mean, when I, excuse me, read the original, language that you have, it sounds like this is exactly what we would want to have, but it is concerning that we might have unintended consequences that will, but in the same time, this is early, and so there'll be plenty of time to flesh things out as this moves through the process. So I'm interested in hearing what the public has to say, especially those people who are really concerned about the potential negative consequences. But yeah, it feels to me like it's the right thing to do, but we don't want to end up doing something that shoots us in the foot later on.
I think just being very clear that the motion that is on here, again, after hearing from public comment, that this just authorizes our board staff to take this language and start their kind of magic, that this is purely draft language, and that as our board staff, specifically Marissa taking the lead, will work with Reza, myself, Macaulay, everybody going through it from BRN level before it gets up to DCA, also meeting with additional stakeholders and experts, including Garrett and his simulation subcommittee on this process to really kind of streamline this and ensure that it's looked at before official language is given back to the NPAC for consideration. So there is time. We don't meet in nurse practice again until I believe June. So it's a couple months, and Garrett and the team here can get together and kind of put this through. We may have language that we can present to nurse practice. If not, we can have language ready for the board. Just because I know that people have been, we're coming up on preparing for our sunset again. And this was a sunset ask. And so as we get ready to write our report in 2025, so next year we'll be writing our sunset report and have it in front of our board in November of next year, where our board will accept a report. Because in 2026, that will be the legislative season or session that our Sunrise bill will be moving forward so that we can be sunrised, however you want to put that, in January 2027. So next year, we will be writing a report. So we do want to move on this language relatively quick so that we can get this through and starting to move through OAL so we can include that in the sunset report to show that we did take the prior sunset recommendation to heart. NEWAC got on it. We are addressing it as a board and we are moving it along so that we can show that we met that, because it was a specific ask for us to set standards for simulations.
I have an ask.
Yes.
I want to commend Jarrett. This is very comprehensive. I just have one question. Down in subsection J, I believe it is. Yes, J. The program shall have written policies and procedures on the following. I'd like to know your thoughts if should we ever, hopefully not, enter a pandemic time, would some of this be altered to fit that hopefully doesn't happen, but that pandemic time? Because we saw across the country that there was varying simulation that was put into place to help these students get through their programs, right? Some of them were caught in the middle. And we had states that went to 100% sim. And so I'm just kind of wondering, would this be an appropriate place in your draft to place something like this? Parameters for hopefully doesn't happen, but pandemic times.
So I'll have to jump in there and say no. And I'll explain to you the reason why I say no. Because it's already spelled out in statute.
Okay.
So
I saw that.
in our statutory language, there is that section that talks about additional provisions when clinical sites are lost.
Okay.
Right. And so that was something that we did bring up through the last sunset process to have that addressed, because we as a board voted to move forward with regulations to change it to a 500 minimum direct patient care hour and then stay silent on the rest. And we were moving with regulations. That language was picked up in our sunset bill. And so that became statute. So we moved to 500 minimum direct patient care hours. When you look at the way credit units are assigned and evaluated, and you look at like Title IV funding, Department of Education, et cetera, it's a 1-to-1 hour calculation or 1-to-3 hour calculation, depending on if you're looking at the older language or the newer language, because there was new credit hour calculations adopted after 2020, which is 3 hours per week of theory in a 15-week semester is 1 credit unit. So it's a 1-to-3 hour kind of 1 week to 3 hours calculation. So we require 18 minimum units. And so that gives us an hour calculation, right? And so we look at the 18 units, we put it out to 15 weeks, which is the standard calculation for Title IV funding. We come up with about 864 hours of clinical experience that are required from our board. 500 of that clinical experience must be in direct patient care. That leaves 364 hours that does not have to be in direct patient care and can be in anything as long as it's addressing the clinical objectives that are outlined in that syllabus and the college catalog, which are the contractual binding documents that are put forth from an academic institution. So with that, it's not 50% SIM. It is about a 40-ish% SIM that we allow right now. However, we did put that caveat in there that was recommended by some unions and the schools agreed on, which was 30 hours that were minimum in each direct patient care area. So minimum of 30 hours of direct patient care in peds, minimum of 30 hours direct patient care in OB, minimum of 30 hours direct patient care in psych. And that has been adopted well. All of our schools are in compliance with that. And that allows for additional hours that could not be met to be moved between courses as long as it's content area, right? That specifically kind of pertains to MedSurg and Geri, because there are typically multiple courses that address MedSurg and Geri, where there's only singular courses that address the 3 specialty areas, being OB, peds, and psych mental health. Now, with that with that language in our sunset that addressed simulation, what happened is they did not take out that 25% of those hours may be done via telehealth in a pandemic. It did not take out that 25%, they can drop down to the 25%. So what I think needs to be clear for our board to understand that if a pandemic or emergency comes and that is done, because we did change it to a minimum of 30 hours, right? What is 25% of 30 hours? That will be the singular requirement that must be completed in direct patient care, which is 7.5 hours, and that can be done 100% in a telehealth manner. I did ask for that language to be removed as part of our sunset bill. It was not removed. That was one of the asks that we put forward as a board, as well as one of the amendments that was not removed. So as it stands right now, Dolores, if we go into another pandemic, if we go into another state of emergency, our graduates would only have to complete in psych, OB, peds, and 7.5 hours each of direct patient care, and that can be 100% telehealth. That is why having these simulation standards are going to be key, right? Because that's not something we can change. That is a law that would have to be changed. That would be legislators that would have to be willing to remove that, as we had requested in the last sunset, to have that removed now that we went to the 500 hours with the 30 in each. So if that's removed, that's great. I think 30 hours at minimum is still something we can manage during a pandemic or a state of emergency. However, with the current law, the way that it's written, it's 7.5 hours. And then additionally, when you look at that 500 hours, depending on how they delineate that out, 50% of that can be removed. So we can drop down to 250 hours total, right? Because that again has that med-surg and Jerry language in there that talks about it going to 50%. And that is what happens when you have a prior law that addresses prior regulation, that regulation is no longer in there. We've changed our law, but we didn't update that next section to have it go smoothly. So it does drastically decrease in our current law any of those requirements based on that language that was put in there from AB 2288 that was not removed with our sunset but kept. They also kept the language in there, Dolores, for concurrency. So they do not have to have in a pandemic or outside of a pandemic, actually, because they actually changed that. Outside of a pandemic, it doesn't even matter. Currently, right now, if they cannot obtain all their clinical direct patient care clinical hours in the same semester that they received their theory content, they can move that to the following semester. That was changed in our sunset bill, and that is there as well.
Laura,
Yes.
I feel like this going into all the pandemic stuff is really not what the agenda item is, though, right? I'm getting a little confused about why we're going in this direction.
I think the simulation part is. And so because this opens up, and that's what that pandemic law did, was allow for an increased use of simulation, not in direct patient care hours. That is why, again, these simulation standards are imperative. And so again, when we were talking earlier, how like one section overlaps and affects this section, this simulation standards, Garrett was not aware, or that MEWAC was not aware that it affects endorsing license applicants. That's why we have to understand that as we address this regulatory section on simulation, it will then affect those simulation provisions that were allotted for with that pandemic statute.
And is this something we would be asking staff to take into consideration as they were drafting the language? Or
we cannot supersede statute with regulations. We can only follow what statute does. And so what Dolores was asking was, can we add something into this regulation so that we don't drop down like that ever again, having lower requirements? And my answer to her was no, that we can't, because this is already set forth in statute. And so when statute is written, we cannot supersede that or change statute with regulatory language. So we will not be able to address that in regulation, any regulations, including these simulation regulations. The only thing these simulation regulations can do is provide guidance for those additional simulation hours that they would then be granted if we were faced in another pandemic.
Sorry, this is Jovita. I see the value in Sims, but here as an educator, I really stick to the bedside hours being the majority. And as a bedside nurse on my other hat, I work with some of the nurses that actually went through a lot of sim due to COVID, the pandemic, and they struggled a lot. They had a hard time doing the bedside, and even though they were, they were intelligent in the sense of, medications and all that people skill. I really don't think that that the Sims it helps because you're working with colleagues. But here's the thing, if your little sim person has a drastic problem due to one of your mistakes, which is good to learn from, it's very different being on the bedside because this is a real person with a real heart and a real lungs and, real problems, social problems. And so that's my take on it. That's why I see the value in sim. I'm not saying that it's not, but having that be comparable to bedside, I really struggle saying yes to that.
You
But that's
would
not
not
what
be
this
saying
agenda
yes to
is
that.
about.
Yeah,
Right.
that's not what this would be about at all, Jovita.
Right.
You would not be saying yes to that. This agenda item does not affect, and again, like I responded to Dolores and again to Mary, is we cannot change statutory language through this regulatory process that we're doing. What we can provide is simulation guidance and standards through this regulatory process so that when and if this happens again in the future, there's better guidance. And that would be kind of what is needed here. And it is imperative because of the amount of simulation hours that are allotted if there is a state of emergency ever declared again.
And to add on to what Lori has given, really good comprehensive answer, Jovita, is that this is important to ensure high quality simulation experiences. And we weren't prepared. So I'm not faulting anybody. We were not prepared for a pandemic. So this helps. I mean, I'm an emergency nurse, and so we like to prepare before we actually like to intervene, right? And so this is all about preparation. And Dolores, to your great question as well, is that if we can create written policies and procedures to make everybody aware, to train them up before we actually need to use it, and implement high quality simulation, then it will. And I'm not going to get into the whole pandemic or issue at all, because that's not the topic at hand, but it will, I think, help everybody just do a better job. And that's the intent.
Definitely. And Dolores, I think I understand your question too, is because we've had NCSBN come in and do presentations at our board meetings recently on the effects of the simulation and what occurred during the pandemic and such. And that is where this is going to be answered. Honestly, we can take that NCSBN study, we can take the information that's given from Garrett here and his team and NEWAC, and we can move forward with and kind of incorporating that. And that might be where our board may consider some language about 100% computer-based simulation. That might not be something that we want to be included in there. And that's going to come from the experts. That would not really be something that we would just kind of haphazardly put in there, because again, just to talk about the regulatory process here, any line item that is on a reg package that goes to OAL, I have to be able to submit evidence as to why we put that. Everything has to be evidence-based. And so Garrett, when we were in NEWAC, Reza and I both clarified, and Garrett was 100% on board with this, that each one of these line items needed to be supported in evidence. And he said he had all of that evidence to give to us, which will help us make this package. And so true to the nursing profession, it would be evidence-based. It would support high quality sim. It does not supersede the direct patient care aspect and how important that is. Our board has established that 500 hours must be that way, and that was the reason why. And I think that with the psychological safety that has really been taken into consideration with Garrett, I think it also answers the DEIB that we have been tasked to look at with our regulations with DCA and from the governor. And so it would ask that, because one of the things that was brought out in the simulation study from NCSBN when they were talking about 50% sim is that minority and males did not do as well with a one-to-one conversion in simulation. And so this, with these standards, would help us to even address that too, that the simulation, as it's looking for psychological safety, we could also address the non-female student and address the minority student so that they can also be successful when utilizing simulation.
Thank you, Lori.
You're
This
welcome.
is Vicki. I was just wondering if I could get some links to some of the research on the psychological issues. I'm finding it really interesting. I don't need any more discussion, but I would like to read some of the research if it's out there, or some of the anecdotal studies. That would be great. Thank
I
you.
can share with you the NCSBN ones. Garrett, if you can provide me the study information via email, I can share it out to you as well, Vicki.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
This is Jovita. I'd like to be tagged on that too.
Yeah, I think it's probably time that we go out to public comment or any other comments or questions from the committee members. I do have one. One of the comments in here, or the statements in this proposed standards, is if the program has already received endorsement from one of the accreditation organizations, that no further additional documentation or action would be required. Do we have information on how many programs have this accreditation in California and also out? Because if a whole lot of them have that, that would actually really take a lot of the potential negative consequences out of the equation.
For California schools, it would not address our endorsing applications because they are educated in schools that are outside of California.
What if they had their programs had accreditation from one of these simulation organizations? That would be appropriate, right? Do we have any information about that?
We do not have it at a national level readily available to us. And so as a applicant would come in, we would then review that school to ensure that they had it, because again, those standards could be obtained and then lost, obtained and lost. And then those standards were only brought forward after 2010. Garrett, do you remember when SIM standards were started?
They've actually been around for a lot longer, but under different iterations. But the current ones, 2010, I believe. But we have around 9 programs right now in California, and the programs are fairly new, but they have rigorous standards. They meet all of the requirements. So we're confident that organizations are going to move forward because it is a mark of distinction. And those programs that are, to Lori's earlier point, is, we're really looking for the bad actors, right? Should they be out there? And that's what the regulations are for. So, the programs that have the national recognitions are really our top performers. And I'm not as worried about them, honestly. So.
Okay. So, and we have about 160 pre-licensure nursing programs in our state. And so we would have to allow, if regulations went forward, for people to come into compliance. We would then also have to take into consideration any kind of budget constraints, especially when we're dealing with our publicly funded programs, the CSUs, the community college, et cetera. But again, those can be things that are taken care of as we move this regulation forward. And we could allow for regulatory language to allow for provisions of schools that are in the process of obtaining, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of further discussion that needs to be had on this, but we can definitely go out to public comment. And just to reiterate, this does not accept this draft language. It accepts this language as a starting point to draft official language to bring back to the board.
Yeah, I'd like to go to public comment before making a motion if committee members are okay with that. Okay, moderator, can you please take us out to public comment?
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment." Marie Gilbert would like to make a comment. 1 second, please.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Good, thank you. My name is Marie Gilbert. I'm the director at the Central California Center for Excellence in Nursing and a longtime simulation educator. I have loved this discussion today. It is such an enlightening, encouraging discussion that we're all on the same page this time. And I just want to kind of reinforce what Garrett was saying, that the simulation community is becoming concerned regarding the psychological safety of our students in simulation. And as simulation continues to expand, and we anticipate, especially in baccalaureate programs, with the move towards competency-based education, simulation will continue to grow. And as it grows, there's the potential for inadequately trained educators to inadvertently or intentionally traumatize students. So there's been a lot of great discussion about potential ways that we can hold programs accountable. The standards, we've talked a lot about the standards, so just a quick information about those. They were the INACSL standards, which we've talked about a lot, actually were implemented in 2011. There's been 4 updates, the most recent in 2021, at which time those standards were written by interprofessional international teams. So the name has changed to Healthcare Simulation Standards. There are actually 10 simulation standards, and the 4 of note for nursing programs I think that we should be looking at are the ones around the pre-briefing, the facilitation, the debriefing, and professional integrity. All of those components will help keep our students safe. Some of the other standards are around interprofessional education, and we know not all nursing programs have the ability to do that. So as this moves forward, looking at maybe those core 4 standards, and there's so much I want to say because the discussion has been so robust, but we are focusing on psychological safety in the way that we can make sure that programs are held accountable. So I really want to thank NEWAC and the board for their efforts to find a means to do that, to hold programs accountable, to follow best practices and ensure that our students are kept safe and that their learning experiences are maximized to reach so that the students reach their potential. So I would love to be involved in these ongoing discussions, and I definitely have evidence and research I'll share with Garrett if he doesn't have it to pass on to those board members that asked for it. So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you for your comment.
And then just to clarify, that information that'll be passed on to the board members, we'll do that as part of board materials for next month. And that way it can be sent to all board members and shared with the public.
Amanda Lee would like to make a comment. 1 second, please.
And I'm representing San Joaquin Delta College, which is a community college in Stockton, California. And I just wanted to chime in to say that I do really appreciate this conversation today. I'm currently working as our simulation coordinator for faculty. And the idea of psychological safety, really creating a space in our simulation labs that allow students to have the experience and the exposure to things that they may not see in the clinical setting on a consistent basis. We often have conversations about the differences and the importance of bedside time and clinical hours and how simulation can support that versus take away from it. And I think some of the feedback that we've gotten from students in our evaluation has been that simulation gives them almost a guaranteed opportunity to see some things and be exposed to different procedures and tasks and critical thinking that they may not get consistently in a clinical setting. So I also would love to be engaged in future conversations around this topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you for your comment. We have no public requests on the WebEx. Do we have any public requests there in Sacramento?
A request for public comment in Sacramento.
Thank you. Committee Chair Fagan, would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. Any other comments or questions from committee members? I'd like to make a motion to approve the NEWAC recommendations on proposed draft regulatory language for standards on simulation and clinical education, and authorize board staff to initiate drafting regulatory language for revisions and/or additions to the California Code of Regulations, CCR, Title 16, Article 3, pre-licensure nursing programs. Can I get a second?
This is Vicki. I'll second.
Thanks. Do we need to take it to public comment again?
We'll just take a vote.
Oh, good. Yay, thanks. Okay, Mary Fagan, I vote yes. Dolores Trillo,
Dolores Trujillo votes yes.
Jovita Dominguez,
Jovita Dominguez, yes.
and Vicki Granowitz.
Granowitz votes yes.
Okay, motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks for your work on this, Garrett.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Garrett.
Take care.
Okay, we will move to agenda item 7.5, discussion and possible action regarding the NPAC and NMAC recommendations on proposed draft regulatory language to amend the recommended guidelines for disciplinary orders and conditions of probation.
So I'll start this one off with kind of the same process that was with this last one, is that if you guys make the motion to accept it, and you can see on the next slide, it's going to be just draft, and that it will continue to get flushed out through the legislative chief of legislation, Marissa, and the team and experts. This did start differently than the last one. So the NEWAC regulations came from the Sunset Bill and was given to the NEWAC, and then a subcommittee brought it forward to NEWAC, and they're here. This language here was something that our staff had identified. And so Shannon Johnson is not available. She's actually in another publicly noticed meeting right now. And so she is not able to do double duty. I would love to clone her. If anybody has that technology, please share. But she is not able to be here. So I would try to give her as much credit as eloquently as I possibly can, which is not going to be the same. But when she was looking at the process and we were looking at the independent practice of our advanced practice RNs, our nurse anesthetists have an independent practice once they've had their services requested. The nurse practitioner, when they move to a 103, has a type of independent practice, means they don't work with standardized procedures. However, when they move to a 104, that is an independent practice, and they are not limited by the setting. So the 103 NP is limited by a setting, right? They can only work within these defined group settings that have been outlined in law, and they must work with a physician or surgeon. So when we're looking at a nurse practitioner as a 103 that's on probation, we can manage that with the required supervision that is brought forth with probation. When they move to a 104, those requirements are no longer there. And so then we had to look at how do we manage this. This 104 NP will exist in probably early 2020, probably mid 2026, or no, by January 2026, sorry. And so we have to have regulations in place by then. We're looking at probably the first applicants probably coming forward mid 2025, which is a year from now. We're going to try to get some regulations in place to accommodate that as well. And that's why this needed to be updated. Additionally, with the passing of SB 1237 for the nurse midwives, it removed the requirement that they also work under standardized procedures, and they can work in their own independent clinics, birth centers, etc. And so everyone except for the CNS, the clinical nurse specialist, has a type of independent practice that if they're put on probation and we have to go into a supervisorial role to ensure public safety, and what that currently is maximum, moderate, and minimal. And maximum means that for the duration that you are working, you have a person that is equal to or higher than your licensure. that is there to oversee you and ensure that public patient safety is upheld. When you go to a moderate supervision, that is half the time that you're in there. And when you go to working, then you go to a minimum supervision that is a check-in twice a shift. So this was identified as a opportunity for us to come in and address that type of person, so that they do not have to basically change their job to allow for them to go back under a supervisorial role. And so there needed to be an update to our disciplinary guidelines. And this is the section that was adapted. So if you start on page 15, there's kind of the background where it does share NMAC discussions and NPAC discussions. So you can see that this language is already kind of being fleshed out and needing to be amended. And then it links to our current disciplinary guidelines and gives some background on that, remembering that Shannon has given the board multiple presentations on disciplinary guidelines and such as we've gone over the last couple of years. And then on page 17, that is the draft language. The text that is just regular text is our current language, and we are not asking to alter that in any way. That does share what they currently are held to, and that's the maximum, moderate, and minimum, and then it addresses home care. The underlined language is the language that we are asking to add to this section. And that addresses the independent practitioner that is an advanced practice RN. And it requires a supervising practitioner to come in and serve that role. This language originated from looking at the osteopathic board, the physician assistant board, the med board, to look at how they manage their independent practitioners when they are going through some kind of probation or disciplinary action. And so that's where we started. That's where Marissa took the launch from. She held several meetings with Reza, myself, Shannon Johnson, our chief of enforcement. She included our assistant executive officer, Yvonne, who oversees those units as well. We included the AG. We sent this language out to the Attorney General because ultimately the Attorney General is who will work this through from a legal perspective as they're being placed into probation, because that does come from a stipulated agreement. And so this is the language that you have in your package on page 17 that was presented to NPAC and NMAC for discussion. Both groups, similarly to NEWAC, discussed it, made some recommendations, and wanted this advanced to nursing practice for consideration. In the page 15 of the AIS, it does share that on March 26th, the second paragraph is what NMAC feedback was, and the third paragraph is what NPAC feedback was. Understanding that NMAC met first, we shared their concerns to the NPAC, and NPAC either accepted them or made additional recommendations. So that's there for you guys to kind of have questions on, talk it through, look at the language. I'm here for questions. Reza is probably more expert in this area than I am, as he kind of works through kind of the disciplinary process more frequently than I do. I do have experience in placing our nurses who are in probation in workplaces and assigning coursework when I kind of filled in as the nursing education consultant when we were looking for to fill the retirement. Fill the position that was vacated by retirement. So we do have some people that can help ask questions, but bear with us. We're not Shannon, and she's fantastic. So thank you.
Questions or comments from committee members? Would this impact nurse anesthetists as well?
It would be for all advanced practice RNs that would have independent practice. That currently is NPs that are 104, nurse midwives, as well as nurse anesthetist. The only one that it wouldn't currently affect is the clinical nurse specialist, because they do not have an independent practice here in the state. However, we do have that CNS advisory group that is looking at regulations. And if that does kind of morph and things are clarified and that practice changes in the future, the language that is here would then include them as well, because it does state just a blanket independent practitioner. And then it does state to establish a practice setting where a board approved advanced practice registered nurse. And so that calls that out, that it is a advanced practice RN. So it's only those 4.
And has the Nurse Anesthetist Advisory Council have a chance to weigh in on this?
Not at this point, no. But again, the difference in that is that the CRNA and the CNS are not statutorily required. They were formed by us, and there is not a statutory language that says all items must go through them first to come to this committee. And so with that committee being held in January, and this language being kind of ready to present in March, it did not meet their cutoff. So this went to NPAC and NMAC. It did not go to CRNA or CNSs at this point. It does not mean that as we move through the regulatory process, this will not go to them, because it will. It just, with timing, has not gone in front of them.
Okay. I'd like to go ahead and make a motion to approve the NPAC and NMAC recommendations on proposed draft regulatory language to amend the recommended guidelines for disciplinary orders and conditions of probation, and authorize the board staff to initiate drafting regulatory language for revisions and or additions to the California Code of Regulations, CCR, Title 16, Article 4, grounds for discipline, disciplinary proceedings, and rehabilitation. Can I get a second?
Yes, I'll second it. This is Dolores.
Can we take this out to public comment, please?
We will be opening for public comment now. Please refer to the screen share for members of the public to see how they should type in their request for comment. I've activated the question and answer feature. Members of the public can indicate they would like to make a comment by typing into the question box, "I would like to make a comment." Please remember, you will have 2 minutes to make your comments. I will not give a reminder as your time approaches. I do not want to interrupt you nor cause you to lose your train of thought. I will mute your microphone and inform you that your time has expired, and we'll move on to the next member of the public. I'll pause for a moment for members of the public to type in, "I would like to make a comment." We have no public comment requests on the WebEx. Do we have any public comments in Sacramento?
No request for public comment in Sacramento.
Thank you. Committee Chair Fagan, would you like me to close this window?
Yes, please. Okay, we'll take this for a vote. Mary Fagan, I vote yes. Dolores Trillo?
Dolores Trillo votes yes.
Jovita Dominguez?
Jovita Dominguez, yes.
And Vicki Granowitz.
Granowitz, yes.
Okay, motion passes. I think that's the end of our agenda for the Nursing Practice Committee, so we will adjourn.
It is. Yes, thank you. And that one was much easier because it doesn't affect the out of state. So thank you guys. Okay.
One other
Board
question.
President,
Also,
yes.
Feels like there's a lot of overlap between that agenda item coming to the Nursing Practice Committee as opposed to the intervention, the Enforcement Investigation and Intervention Committee. Will it go there as well, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that or the full board. So at that point, the intervention committee can discuss. I know that Trisha, the chair of intervention, is online and she was present for this. So she heard all of that discussion. So she has that there already. But absolutely, we can put it to any committee that we need to put it to. And then for stakeholders, this is recorded. And so when this is recorded, we do place it on our web underneath meetings for anybody to look at and review and be aware of any of these discussions. We do send out an email to our listserv that lets them know when our agenda is posted. We also send out the listserv to let them know when our meeting materials are posted. And then we do a follow-up one to let them know when our WebEx or the recordings are posted in case they had to step away or were not able to make it, they can go back and view it. So great questions. Thank you guys for that. We will adjourn this one and we will start with ELC. Board President, are you thinking about a little bio break here
Definitely.
before we move in? When do you want us to return and open with ELC?
Let's do 15 minutes.
15 minutes, so 11 o'clock? I mean, yes. 11 o'clock. Thank you, and we'll start.